On a mild January afternoon in 1919, the streets of Boston's North End were bustling as usual. The sounds of horse-drawn wagons, motor trucks, and trolleys filled the air. But looming over all of this was something far more sinister, an enormous, 50-foot-tall metal tank filled with 2.3 million gallons of thick, dark molasses. Within seconds, everything would change. Without warning, a deep rumble echoed through the streets, followed by the sound of solid metal tearing apart from itself. Suddenly, a 25-foot wave of molasses, fast, deadly, and unstoppable, burst forth, engulfing the streets and crushing everything in its path. But this wasn't a freak accident. The signs were there all along. So what went so wrong that ordinary day? And how did this turn into one of the strangest, deadliest, and least talked about disasters in American history? The story begins not on that fateful day in 1919, but years earlier. In late 1915, the Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, decided to build the massive tank to store molasses that would be converted into industrial alcohol for munitions production during World War I. The demand for explosives was at an all-time high, and the company stood to make a significant profit. Boston's North End being so close to shipping routes was an ideal location for a large storage tank to hold shipments of molasses coming from the Caribbean. So, Purity Distilling Company decided to task Arthur Gell to lead the project. He was the secretary for the company, not an engineer and not someone with any construction experience. Gell contracted Hammond's Iron Works to build the tank. This would be no small structure. It was to stand 50 feet tall, 90 feet in diameter, and be capable of holding 2.3 million gallons of molasses. Arthur Gell was placed under an utterly unrealistic deadline, so in November of 1915, construction began on a massive project that would need to be completed by December 31st, 1915. That was just 2 months. Gell had one mission: cut every corner possible in order to meet this insane deadline and stay on budget. Not only did he not hire a qualified engineer to design it, he constructed it with thinner steel than was advised and did not use nearly enough rivets to hold it together. Proper building codes and safety oversight had yet to be established in 1915, which also contributed to the eventual disaster. Once completed, testing the tank for leaks only consisted of them filling the tank with 6 inches of water. This was another disastrous mistake, all to save time and money. After basically only 8 weeks of construction, on December 29, 1915, the project was declared complete, just in time for its first 1 million gallon molasses shipment arriving 2 days later. Almost immediately, neighbors reported strange sights. Molasses would often ooze from the seams of the tank. Children would scoop up the dripping molasses and take it home to their mothers. And to cover up the leaks, workers simply painted the entire structure brown so that the leaks wouldn't be visible. People claimed they could hear ominous groaning noises coming from the tank, yet despite these warning signs, the tank was left standing. For 3 years it stood there, a giant brown tower casting its shadow over the North End. The residents of Boston had no idea they were living under the shadow of a ticking time bomb. It was January 15th, 1919. The day started like any other. Residents like 65-year-old Bridget Clowerty were milling about their day, completing errands and chores. Bridget lived directly across the street from the giant tank and became used to looking at the giant eyesore. The tank was nearly full, containing over 2 million gallons of molasses, which had been delivered just 2 days prior. What nobody knew was that the warm molasses, newly arrived from the Caribbean, had created immense pressure inside the tank. At about 12:30 p.m., without warning, Bridget heard the sound of gunfire shoot through the streets. It was the rivets holding the tank together, popping one by one. A deafening roar shattered the afternoon calm as the tank burst at its seams. A 25-foot wall of black molasses rushed through the streets at speeds estimated to be 35 miles per hour. It obliterated everything in its path: homes, buildings, freight cars, and people. The force was so immense that anyone in its way were knocked off their feet and instantly drowned in the thick, sticky mess. Others were crushed by debris, thrown into the harbor, or trapped under the weight of the flood. In just a few minutes, the wave had swallowed a 2-block radius, leaving a scene of devastation. 21 people lost their lives, and over 150 others were injured. Horses, wagons, and even sections of elevated train tracks were swept away like they were nothing. Sadly, Bridget Clowerty was one of the victims. Her 3-story home swept away and destroyed with her still in it. In the immediate aftermath, the city was in chaos. Rescue efforts were nearly impossible. Molasses was everywhere, and its thickness slowed down anyone who tried to help. Firemen, police officers, and local volunteers rushed to the scene, wading through waist-deep molasses in an effort to pull out survivors and recover the bodies of those who had perished. The north end was paralyzed. The sticky mess covered streets, homes, and businesses. Cleanup crews struggled to wash away the molasses, using salt water from the harbor and sand to help with absorption. Months later, traces of molasses still lingered. For years, residents claimed they could still smell the sweet yet haunting scent of molasses on hot summer days. The flood wasn't just a tragedy. It led to one of the most complex legal battles of its time. Over 100 lawsuits were filed against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, who claimed the disaster was an act of sabotage by anarchists and not due to any negligence on their part. The investigation, however, revealed a shocking amount of negligence. The tank had never undergone proper safety tests, and it had been poorly designed and constructed right from the start. The company's insistence on rushing the project without concern for safety ultimately cost lives. On April 28, 1925, after 6 years of court hearings, Judge Hugh Ogden ruled that the company was to be held liable for the disaster and paid out $628,000 in damages. That's about $11 million in today's money. It was one of the first cases in U.S. history where a company was held responsible for a major industrial accident due to negligence. The disaster led to changes in building codes and construction oversight. It forced companies to be more accountable for their actions, setting new standards for industrial safety in the United States. Today, if you visit Boston's North End, you won't find any traces of the massive molasses tank. The North End has been rebuilt, and there are no visible signs of the disaster that once claimed the lives of 21 people. But you will find a small plaque commemorating the tragedy, a reminder of the day molasses wreaked havoc on the streets of Boston. The flood remains a haunting reminder of what can happen when greed and negligence take precedence over human life. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, check out this other video about how the humble safety pin was born out of one man's desperation and overwhelming debt.